Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's talk about decoupling. Now, if you don't know what that means, I'm not really the best person to tell you, but you'll find out pretty quickly anyway. It has to do with a big controversy that's gone on for probably 40 years since the publication of a book back in the 70s about the limits to growth. And the idea is that, we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and we're using them up. And when they're all gone, what are we going to do? Well, more recently, some people have said, don't worry, we can have continued economic growth, which we need, and yet not use up more and more resources, but learn to live on a diet of energy and other resources that we can conserve and make last a very, very long time. And so the name of the game is to try to make a sustainable economy that uses few resources, and in these days, what is equally important or more important, an economy that does not pollute with emissions of carbon into the atmosphere and causing global warming. Now, this controversy continues to be a lively one, and today I've invited two people who have a lot to say on the subject. Mark Ducard is I want to start by saying he's a professor of sustainable energy at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. But I'm told that I probably should put that second, because in fact he is all of that, but he's also, and more importantly in a way, the chair of the British Columbia Utilities Commission. And so to do that role, he's taken sort of a leave of absence, although he still supervises graduate students from his academic post. So he's in Vancouver today and will tell us all about how BC is managing to conserve its resources and energy. And in Massachusetts, some obscure little town that I have never been to, is my old friend John Pfeffer, who moved there from Washington, D.C. for reasons that I could not imagine personally. He would much rather live out in the boonies, I guess. So, hi, John. John is the director of Foreign Policy in Focus, the publication of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, which is, for my opinion, the best think tank anywhere. I don't think he's going to argue with me about that, but he does run their online publication, and for the last 2 or 3 years has been chairing a project of sort of his own, which is about what he calls a just transition. Is it going to be possible to decouple the growth of the economy from the amount of resource depletion and pollution that is produced by the economy? Mark, what do you think?
One of the things I've learned is to try to always start out by making sure you know what you agree on what you're talking about. And so I often will come out with, like, do we mean this? Do we mean that? Do we mean that? And I'll explain. One is, when you say economic growth, I'm assuming you're talking about how economists measure it, GDP, gross domestic product, which is the prices of things by their quantity. And because that's what I'm talking about, but I've found people who write books about stopping economic growth and they don't even define it. So I wanted to make sure we agree on that. And if we don't, I'm happy to go with a different definition, but I want to try to define that term. I also want to know if it's economic growth total or per capita, because I think there's an overwhelmingly strong argument for a stable global population at some point, although there are so many who argue against that. So then the question becomes, okay, even though the population is stable, are we still having higher GDP per person? Is that what we mean by economic growth? We're actually wealthier by some definition, or at least the economist definition, prices times quantity. And then I wanted to know, when we say decouple, did we mean that economic growth would decouple, stop economic growth? Or are we just talking about, yeah, we can have economic growth, but things like greenhouse gas emissions can't go up. In fact, they have to go down dramatically. Or do we not just mean the pollutants or the harm, the waste stream of our economic activity? Or do we even mean the flow through of resources? Because Meta, in your intro, and I'm about to stop, by the way, Meta, in your intro, you said conserve resources.
Mhm.
And so I'd love to debate that one, because I think we can even have I think there's some argument that we can have a higher throughput of material and energy resources, while still having less harm on the harm going down. But that's a debating point. So I'll stop there, and give others a chance. I just wanted to say that those are the kind of, I'll come when one of us is talking about something, I'll tend to come back and say, wait a minute, are you talking about this
Mhm.
kind of economic growth or that? I hope that
Okay,
helps.
well, now do not expect me to tell you what the rules are, because you can define it the way you want. And I think it's the first value that you've already contributed is making us aware of the fact that these mean different things, or there are different ways of measuring stuff. And if we're talking about one thing, don't confuse it with the other thing. So
I agree that generally speaking, when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about GDP growth, because that's the standard by which countries, with maybe one exception, use to define growth. But there is a movement, of course, to challenge GDP as the only standard by which we understand prosperity, shall we say? And it was a movement that started on the margins, with people saying we're not happy with GDP because when it comes to resources, for instance, all sorts of harmful activities that take place in the world actually cause an increase in GDP. And so it kind of encourages countries, if they're considering GDP increases, to do harmful things, because it ultimately helps the bottom line being an increase in GDP. And an increase in GDP in the international system is extremely important. I mean, a lot of things are determined by a country's GDP, as well as its per capita GDP, its status within the world of nations, in terms of loans and stuff like that. So it's important, which explains why countries are kind of determined to see an increase in their GDP. But what started at the margins has become something considerably more mainstream. And so you'll even have international financial institutions conducting studies on, well, maybe we should consider alternatives to GDP, or rejiggering GDP, in order to take into account the current crisis that we're in. And the current crisis we're in, of course, is not just climate change, human caused climate change for the most part, by our release of greenhouse gases through a variety of things, activities that we engage in, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or flying to different places, or moving goods from one part of the world to another. We also face, for instance, biodiversity loss. We face, as Meta said, constraints on resources. Of course, for years prior to discussions of climate change, there was concern about peak oil, or peak, fossil fuels, that we would have to make this transition, not because of the impact it was having on the environment necessarily, but because we were seeing the potential end of fossil fuels, and we'd have to find some kind of substitute. But now we, of course, are investigating other possible peaks. Concern that we won't have enough lithium, for instance, for lithium-ion batteries. If all the cars in the world were to, move from gas power to electric, that we wouldn't have enough rare earth elements. So, though they're called rare earth, they're not rare exactly, although some of them are. But still, we may not have enough rare earth elements for these powerful magnets that are necessary for a lot of renewable energy infrastructure. So this concern about peak resources also filters into the conversation of whether we can sustain current levels of growth, and according to GDP, and whether that can even increase in a sustainable way. The one last thing I would say in terms of definitional rigor, I suppose, is if we're talking about growth, are we talking about economic growth, whether it's GDP or GDP per capita, for the entire world? In other words, there is considerable discrepancy in GDP, especially between the global north and the global south. So when people are talking about growth and continuing growth, sometimes there's a distinction made between, okay, well, maybe we have grown enough, so to speak, in the global north, and we can put certain brakes on our growth here, and switch maybe to more qualitative growth approaches. But in the global south, folks, obviously, many parts of the global south lacking electricity, running water, all of the kind of perquisites of modern life. Perhaps they can have or be allowed to, permitted within global rules, global economic rules, to grow more, to catch up, to narrow the gap between global north and global south. So that's another kind of feature in this discussion of economic growth.
A professor at the University of British Columbia who's worked a lot on this, his name is John Hellawell. He's professor emeritus now, but he did time. Who was the person who wrote that book called Bowling Alone, I think, in the United
Mm.
We're all older. We can't remember names
Can't think
anymore.
of his name either, but we all know who you mean.
Okay, so John worked with him for a while and created what's called the happiness index. And this is where you're surveying people and you're correlating it to, yes, how materially wealthy they are and so on. Well, you're trying to see if it correlates. And certain countries score higher, and a lot of it, the high score often relates to trust in other people around you. And so the point is simply, we don't just price times quantity. It misses so much. It is important, and I can come to this when we talk about the developing world, because here's the things that you can buy with money, like healthcare, education, housing, security, or to some degree. But anyway, I wanted to bring that up, that I very much appreciate and agree with John's point. And that's an area on its own that we could explore a fair bit. And I've always thought of someone like John Hellawell as a bit of a mentor, and they do this national. They come out once a year. You've probably seen it in the media because they rank countries and so on in terms of happiness. The second thing, though, which I think is interesting, and this is the idea that both of you mentioned about we're running out of resources, and I think definitely a growing human presence on the planet. It's a fixed planet, so it has fixed amount of resources. What's interesting, though, when I have taught, and I've even put this in a couple of my books, is a schematic I use in which I just have the Earth, and in it I have this human economy, and that economy has energy and material inputs coming into it. And then, hopefully not too much, but it has energy and material wastes, byproducts coming out of it. And so when we like to describe what are the two main threats to sustainability, one of them is that you'll run out of the high quality resources that you were able to exploit to, improve productivity in agriculture or whatever. And the other is that the waste stream will actually soil your nest, that you will harm the Gaian functions of the atmosphere, the ocean, the biosphere. And so here's why I want to make that distinction. Because the resource inputs do come from like market economies. And so at least there's, as you're running out of the quality stuff, there are incentives in there for people who can innovate substitutes for that, or ways of using it more efficiently. And I'm not saying that'll save us from destruction, but at least our market economies work out fairly, or have a chance. When it comes to the waste stream, though, it tends to affect unpriced goods, the atmosphere, the ocean, ecosystems, jungles, whatever. And we don't have market mechanisms for that. And so anyway, I just wanted to point out those two aspects of the sustainability challenge. And that's why sometimes we've said, oh, it's peak oil. We're going to run out of oil. I even remember peak natural gas. And because my PhD is from an energy institute at the University of Grenoble, I was always around a literature of people who said, oh, what happened when we thought we were going to run out of something? Oh my goodness, look at the innovation. We found more somewhere else. We switched to something completely different. And so it would be wrong to say, oh, good, we'll always do that, which some economists will tend to do. Don't worry, the price system and scarcity will innovate and will innovate our way out of every resource exhaustion. But sometimes we've talked about peaks. It's been fun for me to explain to graduate students why those peaks didn't happen. Like, what was the process? And then the last thing I'll point out is the John mentioning about sort of, and I guess this comes from the just transition work, which is just global equity. And I was writing something the other day, which I just looked up, or a year ago, in response to a former colleague and friend, someone named Bill Reese, who's worked a lot on economic sustainability. And I was finding myself agreeing with so much he said, but I did just point out that there are things that humans might innovate that will be measured as economic growth, but could be really important for people in the global, what I'll call the global South. And it involves possibly still using some fossil fuels while capturing the carbon dioxide and burying it. And I'm not saying any of these things are fantastic. Really developing, which we are energy storage options, like huge innovations so that we can use more intermittent solar and wind and even run-of-river hydro. Developments in nuclear fission, where maybe the byproducts are less harmful. Nuclear fusion. I have a son who's a physics mathematician for a nuclear fusion company. So I talk about this a lot. It's interesting. And then, of course, structurally shifting our economies in ways that I think is what John is getting at, where they're providing more of the enjoyment of life for people, those kind of things in the happiness index, and less sort of conspicuous consumption. So we have to figure out how to do policies. It's not easy in democracies because a lot of people aren't going to see that picture of, oh yeah, go ahead, tax me for consuming more. And so I always try to bring people back to a policy question, which I guess is also me meta saying that's why I have at various times accepted to be, I've done a lot of advisory work in Canada over the years. Our climate policies, I've been very involved in those federally and in some provinces, and done some work in the US as well. And why I've agreed to be a regulator at various times, twice in my career. So I've gone on a bit. I had those three areas though. One was the alternatives to GDP. The second was how can we characterize sustainability, resource inputs, waste outputs, and then the third was what's our strategy for global equity.
Can I ask one little dumb question?
Yep.
You talk about the input and the output, the waste. And what arises for me is a question of how much can we use the waste itself as a source of input? In other words, is there a time coming when the city dump will become the great mine that people will use to recover all of the ingredients that got mashed up when the original manufacturing was going on?
So remember, I teach in a program which has a lot of very environmentally oriented graduate students, and so sometimes I like to taunt them a little bit or have fun, and I'll say to them, future generations will be so grateful that we put everything in these landfill dumps. So it's more easy to go in with different devices and collect out the rare minerals and the valuable. So in reality, I think we need to severely that's the policies I work for, constrain our economies so the waste stream is benign. The solar panel is made of organic materials where when it runs out, you throw it in the compost and then you grow food from it. And in some areas, we've been doing this better. So yeah, the waste stream either has to be recycled, it has to be minimized by efficiency, recycled and becoming a resource, or it has to be benign when it gets back into the system, which is like human beings pre-industrial. It was human waste, animal waste, material, wood and organic waste was their byproduct, which became resource inputs for the ecosystem, the biosphere. And we have to be striving towards that. Those are the and people are doing that in some areas.
In terms of alternatives to GDP, Bhutan has been kind of the oft-cited example of a country that has kind of elevated happiness, or its standard, its index of happiness to the heights of a GDP measurement. But what I'm interested in finding is local examples of that, of cities. They could be small cities that attempt to redefine. And I believe that there have been a couple of attempts in Canada with some cities, but really a kind of a groundbreaking model that we can use and hold up to understand quantitatively what it means for rejiggering an economic system. And I often use the example of the guaranteed income, which was also on the margins of debate for years. There was an experiment in Canada, which was largely forgotten for decades, but the one that has come to prominence is Stockton, California, where they didn't, it wasn't for the whole city, but for a small segment of the population, they provided a guaranteed income. And what was important about it was that it kind of destroyed certain hypotheses about what would happen when you provide people with money on a guaranteed basis. The expectation was, well, people would quit their jobs, for instance. There would be no longer any incentive to go out there and work because you were getting money from the government. And it turned out it was actually the opposite. It actually pushed people into the employment world because they finally had enough money either to have daycare, elder care, to pay for additional education, that they could enter the workforce. So to have a concrete example like that is extraordinarily important from my point of view to, buttress, the legitimacy, shall we say, of alternatives to GDP and what might be considered post-growth alternatives. And the question of prices and waste. I mean, one of the things that, one of the pioneering research projects for economists has been kind of understanding the importance of externalities, such as the environment. I mean, for so long, the price of something did not reflect its actual impact, or the impact of its manufacture, its impact of its sitting in a dump somewhere on the environment. And that could be pollution, a variety of different ways, but there are other ways of measuring impact. And that was always considered an externality. It wasn't kind of incorporated into the price of whatever plastic doodad you might buy from Amazon. So an interesting question is, well, if we price things, quote unquote, correctly, I mean, it's hard to know what correct means exactly, but at least incorporating that externality of environmental impact into the original price, and people are actually paying more, because they would end up having to pay more for an object, whether it was a car or a book or whatever, that would perhaps reduce consumption, because obviously people have a limited amount of money. They can only spend it on certain things. But as you said, it would also perhaps push innovation, because, if something is so expensive using current materials and you could find a way of producing it and have less impact on the environment with different materials, well, the market then will invest in that kind of object. For instance, a sodium battery versus a lithium battery. It would be great if we could have batteries that ran on salt, basically, as opposed to lithium, which I suppose is a kind of salt. But anyway, more normal salt we're familiar with. That would be fabulous. So that's interesting on the question of externality and price. The two other things I just want to raise to throw into the conversation. One is, our system, our manufacturing system at the moment is built on planned obsolescence, that we necessarily throw these things out after a year, even if they're perfectly good, but frankly, they're not produced to last that long anyway. So even if we do want to hold on to our iPhone, because we kind of like our iPhone, we discover, oh, actually, we can't use it any longer because there have been software updates, or because the manufacturer of it, the battery inside or whatever, has a certain lifespan, and we can't use it for 10 years. We're lucky if we can use it for 2 or 3 years. So that kind of planned obsolescence, which is baked into our manufacturing, that's something we really have to well, address. We have to remove that as much as possible so that once again we are in a situation where we're using things for much longer and we aren't overburdening the waste stream. And then one last thing I would say is this question of democracy, because what we're talking about here often is sacrifice. We're no longer in a situation in which we can promise unlimited growth without any penalties, i.e., with being blind to the environmental ramifications of what we produce. And so that's going to mean, well, somewhere people are going to have to make sacrifices. And that might be higher prices at the pump for oil, gas. It might be paying more for delivery of your Amazon packages. You can't just assume it's going to be free 2-day shipping because there are costs to having stuff brought to your house in 2 days. And how are people going to determine that? And those are the kind of small level questions. I mean, there are much larger questions related to democratic decision making in terms of the global economy. For instance, how do you determine what a country's carbon footprint should be and how it should be reduced over the years, and how is that made equitable at a global level? How do you come to that conclusion democratically, ensuring that the sacrifice is equally distributed? Because honestly, in the past, whenever there's democratic decision making, it's usually not equitable. I mean, it's those folks who have more power, political power, which is usually connected to some form of economic power, get the lion's share of the policy goods and sacrifice the least, and the folks who have less power sacrifice the most. So how do we address this problem, which is kind of baked into our democracy of decision making around these critical issues of rejiggering the global economy?
Are you
Well,
throwing all of those questions into Mark's lap?
Why not? You could answer them, Meta, if you want.
No, I'll let Mark handle those.
I think they're fantastic questions, and I'm really excited to respond. And again, you're not going to get much Meta. I'm sorry, you're not going to get much disagreement between me and John. But the way I've lived my life is to always be what I call a policy applied economist in sustainability. And so I am always interested in the very kind of questions that John just raised, which is, okay, we have, can sit back as armchair viewers of the world and say, boy, there's some problems here. They should shift over to that. And then though, I want to be like, okay, and how did I help a politician get elected who was sincerely going to try to do that? And how do I help them get policies passed, implemented, and that have a good chance of being sustained? And so guess what? I end up having to help people with a lot of big compromises. And because it isn't, whether it's a democracy or it's some of the great autocracies we have around the planet now in so many countries, who also do need to worry a little bit about what their populations think. The policy side of this is very, very challenging. And John, I've actually even focused mostly not on the equity questions, which are very challenging, but more on I've said to people, let's try to have an environmentally sustainable human activity on this planet, even if it's a slave state. Now, I mean, I just throw that out as a provocative extreme. And I know a lot of people don't want you to separate these two things, social equity and environmental sustainability. And mostly I don't either, but I'm just trying to help us sort of say, wait a minute, we may not achieve both objectives. It could be that some kinds of equity are a many 100-year project for human beings, but we better make sure that we're not having catastrophic storms destroying everything, because those will have huge equity effects, and they'll mostly happen where people are most vulnerable. The people who are vulnerable will be the ones who can least adapt to those and protect themselves and recover from it. So let me just touch on the three things. One was your question about guaranteed income. And so I know the term guaranteed income has been out there. Even economists talked about it in the 70s, Milton Friedman.
Mhm.
And and so it could be a guaranteed income, but in many countries, the ones welfare states as we call them, they do have a guaranteed income. It may be too low for you, but we don't just let people starve. And even in the United States, maybe they have like food stamps because you don't want to give money, whatever. So I know Scandinavia quite well because I was married to a Danish woman for 20 years, and I remember my father-in-law was a surgeon, but he was on the local council, and he'd come back and I'd be visiting him and he'd say, we just had to determine what kind of television sets we were acquiring for the low-income people in the housing projects. Because we don't give them money. We give them a bit of money, but we give them food and we give them this and we give them that. A lot of them have had drug issues and other issues in their lives. So you look at some of the Scandinavian countries and they have done pretty good in terms of some of the things that you would expect from a guaranteed income: free education, incredibly cheap daycare, supported housing, in efficient buildings where your energy costs, housing developments where you don't need a car. And it goes on and on from that. And those societies have been able to do it. It's been interesting, though, if you look over time, that under democracy, there is some limit to what they want to do with that guaranteed income. And all of those countries have moved somewhat away from, well, a couple of things, away from their high levels of marginal taxation on people, realizing that we just can't make that fly democratically. Like, they're fairly democratic societies. And another is realizing they have to kind of close their borders a bit because they made it so well for low-income people that there's a lot of people want to go there and have their opportunities. And so yes to societies that try to be more equitable, but there are these policy constraints and challenges to doing that. And so I try to look at who did what. So maybe Stockton's trying to do something, but I think we have really good examples of things that have been going on since the Second World War. And we can kind of guess where they might end up. They don't end up totally equitable, but they're way more equitable than our societies. The second thing was on, putting a price on pollution. Here you might have fun, but this is where I've, in my career, fought back a lot against conventional economists. Because economists will tend to say, and I agree with them, the most economically efficient way to reduce a pollutant is to put a price on it. Because then you don't regulate people or technologies or energy forms or activities. You just put that price in and then people figure out what they're going to do. Politically, that is really difficult. And so actually, that's what my last book was called, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success with Cambridge University Press. And I have a lot in there about what I call flexible regulations. If you look at the jurisdictions that have actually decarbonized in their electricity sector or their building sector, or they're now doing it in their vehicle sector, and we have major success stories now in the world, and they've usually used a price on pollution, but it's only played a minor role, if at all. I could even look at California. I work with modelers there, and we've separated out, okay, they have a zero emission vehicle mandate, they have a low carbon fuel standard, the clean electricity or renewable portfolio or clean electricity regulation. A lot of these policies are actually a kind of regulation, but they're flexible so that they almost act a bit like a price, but they don't put the bullseye on the politician's back. They don't have this red flag, this is a price on pollution, so that climate insincere politicians can easily use that to get into power and then do nothing or slow walk all this stuff. So it's been interesting to me because I once got involved a little bit with a group that wants to put prices on all pollution, and they're based in Vermont or something, like at the law school there, and they do international meetings, and I stopped going because I kept saying a price on pollution is so politically difficult, and there are other ways to do it, and we have examples all around the world. Why are you guys so? It's almost like if you have a hammer, everything look like they want prices on any kind of pollutant, and so I've tended to say, good on you. Work hard if you want. But maybe some of you will join me because British Columbia or Canada, I helped Canada put a zero emission vehicle mandate that was implemented in the last few years. That was a lot of work. A clean fuel standard, a clean electricity regulation that is just coming in, and they're very similar to what you already see in California and in Scandinavian countries. And then the last thing was on planned obsolescence, and I agree with you. That is such a huge challenge. It's funny though, like again, an economist would say, well, consumers just need to do better. And what they pick, don't just go for the cheapest upfront cost of something. It is interesting that there was this period in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s when Japanese cars beat out North American cars because they actually lasted longer and they got this reputation for lasting longer. And I remember being in some conferences and some triumphant economists said, see, there is no planned obsolescence. And I was like, oh, good. We're going to see this everywhere, but we never did. And it's like you and I going to buy something in the store and then, oh my goodness, the one thing is way cheaper. Sometimes it's the only option. And so I don't know how to solve that one. I think it's got to be regulation of some kind, and I don't know how to do that politically. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's really very helpful. I mean, I would add to the Japanese car example, we do see kind of artisanal products that are on the edge of the market. A shoe manufacturer who says, these shoes will last your lifetime. If they don't, you can send them back and we'll replace them. So they provide this kind of replacement guarantee, or socks or something like that. But
Yep.
these are niche markets. The question is, how do you take that into the mainstream? And that raises the larger question of whether the market can be tweaked, and that was my example of kind of bringing in the externalities to change the pricing, or whether that actually is a quixotic effort. And I tend to favor your perspective, which is that's kind of quixotic, at least from a policy point of view, because you can't get this stuff passed, because it's kind of a third rail issue. A politician is going to get zapped when they try to grab hold of it. And that's kind of my attitude about pricing more generally, or some of these other policies that are efforts to kind of rein in fossil fuel sector, for instance, like putting a price on carbon, or taxing in increasingly heavy amounts the fossil fuel companies and oil company. On the one hand, let's just take the fossil fuel tax for a moment. On the one hand, it seems eminently sensible. I mean, you want to raise some money. You need money, to address climate change. Why don't you go to where there is a lot of money, especially excess profits? And we know that fossil fuel companies, Shell, et cetera, have made enormous amounts of money. Even in just the last few years, their excess profits have been extraordinary. So, hey, let's just go in there and tax them, get that money, and then use it for a good purpose. Well, that sounds great, and perhaps that could even, I mean, if we were just talking democracy, like a vote, you probably would get, maybe you could get support for that because you could demonize the fossil fuel companies, and people are like, yeah, let's go get them. Of course, that does not take into account the power that fossil fuel companies have, their lobbyists, et cetera, who can kind of short circuit any kind of democratic vote, perhaps, but also the fear that people would have that the price at the pump would go up. And that, as we see in the US elections right now, is an overwhelming concern for the Democrats who want to make sure that people see that they've controlled prices, especially price of gas, and therefore they're doing whatever they can to ensure that the flow of cheap energy continues at least until our election, and then there'll be a period afterwards where they can go after the fossil fuel companies. But another problem with this, of course, is that you're trying to push, for instance, energy companies into to put their investments into another branch of their activities. So move the money away from investments into oil exploration and into solar panel production or whatever. I mean, because oil companies have diversified over the years, and so a heavy tax perhaps will push them in that direction. Um, but I'm not sure that that's the best way necessarily of pushing fossil fuel companies in that direction. And second of all, the flow of money that you are using to address climate change, you've now kind of fatally connected that to the success of fossil fuel companies. So God forbid, you should drive these fossil fuel companies out of business because suddenly you no longer be able to tax them. So that's another kind of problem with that issue. And then finally, on the guaranteed income, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, take a look at Sweden. Sweden was, of course, one of the leaders in terms of equitable economies, kind of bringing socialist principles into the heart of a market economy. And they've spent the last 20 years basically running, screaming in the other direction, including policies that were implemented by the Social Democratic Party. So it wasn't just like the conservatives took over and transformed things. It was the Social Democrats themselves who started to adopt neoliberal principles. But the reason I brought it up was not so much to be in favor of it, although God knows the United States is in a different position than even Scandinavia today, or Canada for that matter. So we're starting from a pretty low level in terms of what the government provides for basic stuff. I mean, not healthcare actually, except if you include Obamacare. But the reason I brought it up was not so much to cheerlead for that kind of economic policy, but to say that what we need, what I've been pushing for in terms of post-growth alternatives, is a Stockton-like example. In other words, we need something that can address some of the stereotypes of what happens if you constrain growth or if you define growth in different ways. Certain expectations like, well, you'll enter a death spiral. The economy will enter a death spiral. If you're not growing, well, we can't even conceive of that. We're talking suddenly you'll become like the Middle Ages, and economies are not growing. If populations aren't growing, then countries contract, and you enter into a kind of nightmare Japan scenario in which your population is declining precipitously and you're losing ground economically, although Japan, frankly, is doing okay economically. But anyway, according to the nightmare scenario, that's what will happen in a degrowth or a post-growth scenario. But it would be useful to find examples or to kind of do basically experiments at a local level, like the Stockton example is an experiment at a local level to address these, to test these hypotheses. If you, for instance, are growing as an economy, but you're growing more in terms of services that are having considerably less malign impact on resources and on the environment. So instead of producing more plastic closet organizers, for instance, plastic widgets of all sorts, you have growth in teachers, childcare workers, and a variety of services for quote unquote the happiness index or quotient of a society. Will that, if enacted, say, on a local basis, like the Stockton experiment, what impact will that have on economies, on the local economy, according to a variety of different standards?
But I want to explain why someone in the Midwest United States whose friends work on farms or who's in the oil industry or construction or whatever is going to wonder when some politician tries to get elected in their town to have a guaranteed income from everyone, because they'll be like, well, where'd the guaranteed income come from? Okay, you're going to tax the rest of us and we're going to have a guaranteed income. How's that going to work? So in 1992, so 2 and 3 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the International Energy Agency, this economist, they sent me to Hungary to help the Hungary. It had its own, it had a national electricity utility, and they didn't know what to do. Are we going to privatize this, and how are we going to make it more efficient? So they flew me over to Hungary to meet with these people, and then I helped them for the next couple of months. And first thing I did is I tried to look at a system that was similar. And as a Canadian, I realized, okay, the population of Hungary is about the same as the Canadian province of Ontario at the time. And then we produce way more electricity, but that's fine. And then I got there and I started to gather research. And it turned out that Ontario at that time in its whole electricity system had about 8,000 to 9,000 employees. So that's generating electricity, transmitting it, distributing it. Hungary had 45,000 employees. And so it's like, okay, 8,000 versus 45,000. So already right there, you're producing less wealth and value for your society. Those extra 30,000 people could have been doing healthcare or, housing or whatever, but they were in the electricity industry. So I really focused my questions on this, of course, and I'm less like, what was going on? And so here's what I think I learned. And again, it's anecdotal though. The managers would say to me, well, we actually have people who intrinsically love work and they will go to work. And everybody's guaranteed the same income, by the way. And we give a slightly higher income for the educated, the higher technical training, but it's pretty close. And those people tend to go to work because they get self-fulfilled. But we have a whole bunch of other jobs here. We have to clean the place. There are regular things for safety to maintain. There are uncomfortable jobs. You got to go out on the lines and maintain the lines. And so we do change income salaries a little bit for that, but they're all pretty close. And what we find is we have a significant number of people who don't go to work, who just keep calling in sick. And some of them usually have a brother-in-law who's high up in the Communist Party or in the management. But even if they didn't, we couldn't really cut them off. Then we have about another third of people who see this, and then they work less. And so I don't know about humans and human motivations and how you can motivate humans other than money. And I know humans are motivated other than money. So I'm not trying to give you this right-wing story. I'm just saying that was what I discovered right there. And it did kind of affect me. It made me realize, gee, maybe I understand why we don't have the same guaranteed income for everyone. If you're just so then I started, so I'm grappling more with this problem, and it made me stop talking about a guaranteed annual income and just talk about a society like Scandinavia today, what Canada strives for, who just has free healthcare, education's free up to some level. We support lower income people at the highest education levels. We do everything we can to give people equal opportunity. But I'm not sure if the word guaranteed income is helpful or harmful. Like if you'll probably get some city councilors in some town somewhere in Stockton or Berkeley or wherever who will try it. But will it sustain itself? Because it hasn't so far. That movement has been around for a very long time. So I try to see, where did we get success? What jurisdictions and how they do it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, and I perhaps I shouldn't have brought up the example of Stockton. I just wanted to use it as an example of some kind of quantitative study that could be applied to what we're talking about here, growth. But since you brought up Hungary, I mean, what's interesting about Hungary is that the transformation in Hungary was largely as a result of a very powerful environmental movement, an environmental movement that challenged a dam that was being constructed on the border between Hungary and Slovakia at the time. And this brought down, essentially brought down the communist government. I mean, there were other movements in Hungary at the time, but the environmental movement was perhaps the strongest. Today, that environmental movement doesn't exist for the most part. And for me, this is an important question in terms of real policy in a real country. How do we kind of bring these issues of the limits to growth, the problems of environmental impact for the policies that we propose, how do we bring that to the foreground in a sustainable manner? In other words, yeah, we could do it for one election cycle, but if it doesn't survive that election cycle, it'll be undone by the next administration. So how do you do this in a democratic way, institutionalize these efforts? Because Hungary experienced an extraordinary backlash against what was perceived as a overly liberal transformation of the economy after the collapse of communism.
It's Mark's fault.
No, no, it's not Mark. I will not blame Mark. No, no. But you know, the Liberal Party basically, which was in charge effectively when you were there in 1992, disappeared as a political party several years later. Disappeared, completely disappeared, along with the environmental movement, which was a supporter in some cases of these for other reasons, not economic reasons, but the social agenda of the Liberal Party. And now what we have in Hungary is a basically far right populist government that really doesn't care very much about environmental issues whatsoever, but has built its reputation on its anti-liberal politicking. And for me, that's kind of the essential question. We have what maybe you and I, maybe Meta too, agrees, are essential policies that we have to push for because we have a time limit. We're facing, as you said, extraordinary potential cataclysms caused by climate change and other things. And we have a political structure that perhaps is not that well structured for addressing a catastrophe in the making on the horizon like this. And we have an economy which is kind of pushing us inexorably in that direction, even if there are lots of actors in that economy who see the problem and are proposing any number of fixes for that, but are not having any major impact on either the economy at a national level for the most part, with some exceptions, or Uruguay, maybe Costa Rica. But globally, no. That for me is the big political question. Are we going to be able to put something in place, as the Hungarian liberals managed to do as a kind of change in system, without triggering an enormous backlash that will undo everything that we have been pushing for?
Wow. Listen, we're coming toward the end, and it sounds to me like I've got to reach an inference about what you guys have advised me to how to change my thinking. And boy, it's painful, I tell you, because the lesson I'm taking from this, and I want to check with you, is this really what you want me to get out of all of this? Don't do carbon pricing. Do something else instead. Is that the message? Whoa, that's hard. Mark, is that what I'm supposed to go home and tell everybody that I know I've learned from you?
No. So, but I'm glad you asked it in that way, and because that does lead to how I was going to respond to John anyway. I mean, John, you'll get a chance to come back, but it felt like I was talking about the equity side that you're interested in, and you kind of switched it back over to environment. I'd be interested if the future governments then implemented the guaranteed income for everyone in Hungary, because I don't think they did. You know, like that thing died out. That 30, 40-year experiment of guaranteed income for everyone died out in Hungary, and they're back to the system we have. But I'll let
I
you.
would say two
go ahead.
two quick things on that. One is that they did provide a guaranteed income for members of the ruling party, because they effectively reproduced your example with the electric company across the economy, but just for the members of the ruling party. So it's a patronage system. But if we want to look at Poland, a neighboring country that had a similar kind of backlash against liberalism, they actually did, the ruling Law and Justice Party did implement something like a guaranteed basic income. It was for specific sectors of the economy. It was for young people who were suffering, but also for families, because they wanted to encourage birth rate. So, I mean, they were politically motivated guaranteed basic income that could never be associated with communism or socialism, but were associated more with, say, the nationalist objectives of the ruling party.
Sure. And my point was simply, that's a really tricky way to run an electricity system. And I do know that all of the countries in Eastern Europe move to electricity systems that no longer allowed you to be paid for not showing up for work. Maybe if your brother was the CEO of the company, but in general, their efficiency level, their labor efficiency for electricity improved dramatically. And I've seen the statistics
Yeah.
like over a 15-year period. So, but let's not get caught up on that because I think I want to answer Meta's question because here's how I kind of boil it down. Let's say what we've talked about today is, we're running out of resources. Waste stream. Meta, first takeaway from my perspective, John can counter these, focus more on the waste stream. Now, because the other one at least has scarcity and market mechanisms. So you don't ignore it, but I would focus on the waste stream. Also, local waste stream, like someone wanting to build a dam in Hungary or on the Hungary-Czech border, those are easier. But we really need to focus on those wastes that have a global implication. And so we have to think about the policies to do that. Now, what policies? You've sort of said, oh, Mark, just don't get rid of get rid of the carbon tax. No, what I've said is get excited about what's working. Start looking at examples that work. So, Ontario phased out its coal plants. They did it with a regulation. They didn't do carbon pricing in Ontario. So in my last book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, I go through example after example around the world where jurisdictions decarbonized without relying on carbon pricing. They used regulations, and these regulations I'm just mentioning were flexible so that they could be sellable to some economists like me and business people, because they weren't just everybody has to buy this kind of car, everybody has to get this kind of electricity generating plant. Everyone in Ontario, it's all solar, or it's all wind, or it's all nuclear. It was a regulation that phased out coal plants. And so, Meta, there's wonderful examples all around you.
Okay, but look, you're making that point. I don't argue with that point that there's something to be said for looking at what works instead of carbon pricing. But John went further. He said, if I understand him, don't do carbon pricing because you'll create a backlash, a political backlash, and you'll get something like what we have in Hungary today, this right-wing horrible government. And you'll get that elsewhere if you do carbon pricing. All right, John, is that really what anybody really meant to say, or am I really
so let me jump in just because I'm almost finished, and that is, I don't think John's going to say that. I think what I heard John say was, you're right, Mark, it's got political challenges to it. And my only point, Meta, was that, because John might not know this, but in Canada, there's a very good chance that our carbon price, which was very successful, is going to be eliminated in the next year because of political change. And I just don't want Meta and other people like that to despair that, we failed completely. That's why I'm bringing that up. And my last point is, when you do those kind of flexible regs that I'm talking about that we've been doing, you'll find that, and I'm finished, more of these will result in technology change rather than behavior change. We might wish to have behavior change, but let's not bet the future of the planet on human behavioral change. So you pick different technologies. You say to people, you know what Volvo did. You're going to make a car. Every piece of that car, we have to be able to recycle and actually repurpose. And you do that with regulations for sustainability for waste streams. And I'll stop there and hand it over to John and Meta.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that going the regulatory path is absolutely the way to reduce carbon emissions, whether we're talking about the examples you suggested, or China making the unilateral decision, although under pressure, to stop exporting or building, essentially, or helping build coal-fired power plants around the world. It didn't stop them from building them in their own country, but at least that's, and I mean, it's going to be hard to win an election by saying more regulation, because the term regulation, especially in the United States, the term regulation is not the sexiest or the most popular term, but I believe it's absolutely the way to go. We might be able to talk about it in different ways to make it more politically palatable. But restricting oil companies from digging places, restricting companies from, mining seabeds. I mean, we can call those regulations, we can call those restrictions, we can call them what we like, but that fundamentally is shutting down essentially the worst kinds of production side
Okay, look, I have learned. I mean, it's time to quit, but I'm going to absorb the message. It's not, it's a hard lesson for me to absorb, frankly, but both of you are persuasive, and and you're also knowledgeable about economics. So I'll go off and mull this over and try to absorb the lesson. It's been a fun excursion anyway. Thank you both. It's been a lot of fun and I've enjoyed it very much. So appreciate it. Okay.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thank you, Madeline.
Absolutely, and
Thank you, Lauren.
great to meet both of you. That was a lot of fun. I really appreciate that you invited me. Great exchange.
Okay, very good. Carry on. I'll get you back to another time. Bye bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Project Save the World produces these forums, and this is episode number 624. You can find all of them on our website. Just go to savetheworld.ca and look at the scroll window on the home page. You can scroll around till you find a topic that interests you and then click, and you can watch the forum right there. Project Save the World also produces a short course for people who want to become leaders in the movement to repair the climate. This course is available free of charge on the online learning platform Udemy. It consists of 5 short lessons about the use of soil amendments as a way of removing carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it in the earth, thereby improving agriculture and increasing the world's food production while reducing the need for synthetic fertilizers. The course is entitled Become a Climate Change Influencer, and you can learn more about it at this link, www.udemy.com/course/become-climate-change-influencer. Finally, Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.